Cold front, Georgetown, Bahamas, winter of '92, age 12. Michelle was in Georgetown the year I was 12. We'd bumped into each other yearly, although not at any consistent time or place. Her dad's cruising schedule was much less regular than ours. Sometimes he spent months at Norman's Cay, and sometimes he sailed straight to Georgetown. Once we saw each other in Nassau for a couple of hours, and that was the only chance we had that year to catch up. We spent the time gabbing incessantly over boys and music. Gary had just remarried and bought a Morgan Out Island 41 named Summer Wind, a tub of a boat, but one with a hell of a lot of room, which was good because his new wife had plans for lots of kids. My parents were friendly with Gary and always went out of their way to make sure Michelle and I could see each other. But yet there was this subtle difference between our families that at that age I sensed but couldn't define. By 1992, Michelle was one of those strong girls who could arm wrestle any of the guys on Volleyball Beach until she made them cry. She had spark green eyes and lots of dark hair that she didn't really like to brush, so it always hung in her face. Terry, her stepmom, gave her a layered haircut that made her look like an upright mop. Michelle wore a baggy New Kids on the Block t-shirt over her bathing suit every day, trying to cover up her changing body. When I saw her for the first time that year on Volleyball Beach, I told her that her legs would look thinner if she shaved them. That's what Trey and the kids at Narrows Marina in Virginia had told me the summer before. They'd also told me that my hips were too big. They stood behind me while I walked, my thighs rubbing against each other, and called out, "Thunder thighs, buffalo butt." Really, she raised her black eyebrows and leaned forward so she could look at her legs. "Do you think they look fat?" No, I said. Michelle's legs were a lot thinner than mine. Michelle and I sat on an old splintery picnic bench under the biggest Australian pine on Volleyball Beach. It was on the west side of the beach, opposite the volleyball courts, and we could look across the harbor through the mess of anchored boats to town, which was just a sprinkling of pink and white buildings against the low green scrub of Great Exuma. We were old enough to be on the beach by ourselves now. My parents usually dropped me off after school. Michelle turned a paperback book over in her hands. Its cover was green from the mildew that grew on every bookshelf on every boat. "Hey, you should read this," she said. "Oh yeah?" I'd gone through every Nancy Drew book in the Georgetown library and had read The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings stories multiple times, so I was eager for new recommendations. I could always reread The Island of the Blue Dolphins, but after 7 times it was getting predictable. "It's a romance novel," she said, overstressing the first syllable. "Is it good?" "Listen to this," she said. She read something about a throbbing erection, and we both burst out laughing. "That's sick," I said. "Does your dad know you're reading stuff like that?" "Hey, it's Terry's book," she said. A burst of giggling erupted from behind the Australian pine, and Carolyn and one of her 10-year-old friends started pelting us with the tiny, hard pine cones that covered the beach. They whooshed through the air and stung when they hit our sunburned shoulders and chest. "Hey, don't do that." I stood on the bench and tried to swat the pine cones as they came, missing most of them. Then one flew at me extra hard and from another direction and hit me on the chest. Rod had joined the younger kids in the attack, and now he jumped up and down and screamed, "Woohoo!" right in the boob. He grabbed another handful from my sister, who was scurrying around the brush and gathering them as fast as she could. "Rod, you're a jerk," Michelle said. "You can do better than that." Rob hurled a cone at Michelle but missed. "Why don't you call me an asshole?" What, you're not allowed to say bad words or something? Just ignore him. I sat back down next to Michelle. That never works, she said. She covered the back of her head with the romance novel. Rod jumped up on the bench behind us. Hey, you all should come see the fort we built, he said. Where is it? I turned just in time for another pine cone to graze my cheek. Back in the bushes, he said. He pointed to the middle of the beach, which was actually a peninsula jutting out into Elizabeth Harbor. The center of the peninsula was overgrown with palmetto scrub and buttonwood and sea grapes, and people were always losing dogs and children in there. I bet it's a crappy fort, Michelle said, but she left her book on the picnic table and we followed Rod into the bushes. Carolyn and her friend were already way ahead of us. They're building their own fort, Rod said. He stopped at a clearing somewhere in the middle of the peninsula. This is it. Michelle looked around, her hands resting on her hips. This isn't a fort. It kind of is, Rod said. See, these are the walls. He pointed to some vines and a palmetto thatch that he'd laced between the branches of a sea grape tree. It's got a nice floor, he said, thumping the sand with his foot. Yeah, but that didn't take any effort, Michelle said. I stared up at the twisted branches overhead. I kinda liked it back here. At least it was shady. The slanted beams of sunlight that made it through the scrub danced on the ground in orange patches. It was getting late. I'm leaving, Michelle said. Don't go. I didn't want to go back out to the beach, but I was suddenly a bit nervous at the prospect of being left alone with Rod. It's time for me to go home and fix dinner, she said. Michelle had more responsibilities than any other 12-year-old I knew. What are you making? Rod took his sunglasses off and hung them on a branch. Mac and cheese. She stormed off, not bothering to say goodbye. That's the way she was, always on some kind of mission, always in a hurry to get to the next thing. I admired the way she moved. Rod and I were stuck in the fort, standing at opposite sides, awkward as hell. Maybe I should go too, I said. Maybe not, Rod said. He crossed the fort and put his arms over my shoulders and stuck his tongue in my mouth. Somehow he managed to be a smooth talker at 12. I guess some people are just born with it. I hoped it would be over soon, even though I knew I was supposed to be enjoying this. I wondered if my sister and her friend were hiding somewhere, watching us. I figured they probably were. This was a kissing marathon, like we were trying to see how long we could go without choking on each other's spit. It wasn't my first kiss. That had been a few weeks ago, under the monument with Rod. It had been a lot quicker and softer and a lot more pleasant. This just felt like something we were supposed to do, even though neither of us enjoyed it that much. We decided in some childish way that we were boyfriend and girlfriend, which really just meant that we snuck off every now and then to kiss. The light was turning orange, and I knew Dad would be coming ashore soon to pick Carolyn and me up, so I pulled away from Rod. On the way back to the beach, I spit several times, trying to get Rod's saliva out of my mouth. I hoped he wouldn't notice. Dad stood by the Australian pine, staring straight at us. It's time to go, he said. He didn't acknowledge Rod. He set a book he'd been holding back on the picnic table and turned to where our aluminum dinghy was pulled up on the beach. Carolyn was already in the dink. When I passed the table, I saw the book was Michelle's romance novel, sitting open, the pages fluttering like signal flags. I grabbed it and tucked it under my shirt. I wonder which part Dad had read. That night, a cold front rolled over the Exumas, and the wind funneled through the hatch over my bed and brought rain and earthy smells in with it. I thought about the rain pouring down the face of the monument, dislodging sand and rocks and the small coral fossils that we found there all the time. The only way to describe the smell of rain in the Bahamas is to say it's green, like when you crumple leaves together and their juices leak onto your hands and you smell them still living even though you've just broken them. The air was clean and dry in the morning, and I sat in the V-berth with a heavy math book on my knees, trying to work out some pre-algebra equations that seemed impossibly hard. I didn't know when I'd be able to get off the boat again, because the wind was blowing 20 knots, and cold air was pouring down the forward hatch from the front that had passed through overnight. Chenoo pulled at her anchor chain, her bow riding over the waves that rolled down Elizabeth Harbor. Getting into the dinghy to go ashore would be uncomfortable, if not downright treacherous, for a day or so. The lead of my number 2 pencil kept breaking, and I kept getting up to sharpen it over the trash can in the galley. Carolyn sat at the table in the main cabin, building something out of modeling clay. "Melanie, can you come back here for a minute?" Dad stood in the doorway to the aft cabin, 1 foot at the top of the steps. Carolyn rolled her eyes at me as I walked past. I wondered what he'd do if I said no. The aft cabin was always darker than the rest of the boat. Dad had his computer set up on a big slab of a desk that he'd hired a carpenter in Virginia to fit into the space between the foot of the queen-sized bed and the door to the aft head. The little bit of light that came into the room filtered through the 2 portholes into the stern. It was always dusty back there, because Dad didn't like any of us to come in and clean while he was writing his articles. He had papers scattered all over the floor and the desk. I sat down on the bottom step, not fully inside the cabin. "What do you want?" I asked. He leaned back in the folding chair at his desk and saved his work on the computer. His hair stuck up straight on top of his head, and I thought about how Mom had said once, he's afraid it'll fall out if he brushes it. He just left it looking like a rat's nest until it was time to make a trip into town. Then he'd comb the top layer so that it was smooth over the tangles. "I saw you and Rod come out of the bushes yesterday," he said. "Uh-huh," I said, trying to sound like it was no big deal. "What happened back there?" he asked. What did he want me to say? I felt uncomfortable as hell, like Mom should be asking me this stuff and not Dad. After all, Mom was the one who 3 years before had given me the sex talk. I think I must have been the only kid alive who at 9 had no idea how babies were made. Sex ed wasn't part of the homeschool curriculum. I'd asked her something about the Virgin Mary, and she'd asked me if I knew what a virgin was, and we'd spent the next 3 hours sitting in the forward cabin talking about the logistics of reproduction. That night I told Carolyn, horrified at the idea that she would have to live in the dark as long as I had. He kissed me," I said. Dad's knuckles turned white on the arms of his folding chair. "Is that all?" Yeah, that's all." "Well, I just want you to know what people will think of you if they see you coming out of the bushes with a boy," he said. "Huh? Just don't let it happen again." "What are you talking about?" "People see you come out of the bushes with Rod, and they'll laugh at you," he said. "They'll call you a slut, or it'll make our whole family look bad. That's not the way we are raising you." I had no idea what he was talking about. I wasn't doing anything on Volleyball Beach that the other kids weren't doing. I just got caught. "I don't think anybody's going to call me a slut, Dad," I said. He just frowned and stared at his computer screen. "You don't think that people will, but they will. That's just the way the world works. And I don't want people to think bad things about you," he said. "What will people think of Rod?" I knew the answer, but I had to ask. I had to hear what my dad would say. "It's different with boys. Boys brag about kissing girls, and people encourage them to act that way," Dad said. "Then nobody is going to call Rod a slut." No, Dad and I were both silent as we both pondered this. We both knew how wrong it was, but we both knew that it was undeniably true. The world isn't fair, Melanie. I don't like that, and somehow, somewhere in the deep, deep recesses of my mind and the flesh and bones of my being, I knew that I would fight that unfairness. I decided that afternoon that I simply wouldn't get caught next time, and I decided that I would not change my behavior simply because I was afraid of what people would say. I knew that part of my dad's lecture had to do with the way he wanted the world to perceive our family. We were wholesome and harmonious. We lived on a boat and baked our own bread and caught our own fish for dinner. We were smart and pure. We were not slutty. But I also knew that my dad didn't want me to be blind to the way the rest of the world would perceive a girl who did her own thing and ran off on the beach to make out with boys. Some cold fronts take their time. They stall out on top of you and kick the waves into a frenzy, and when they finally pass, you're stuck with air that's unnaturally cold for February in the Bahamas. The one that came through the night after Dad caught me making out on Volleyball Beach lasted 3 days. On day 1, the wind came up out of the southeast, masses of air being sucked across pressure gradients before the front. In the middle of the next night, Chenu swung 180 degrees on her anchor chain as the wind moved around to the northwest. Since Elizabeth Harbor ran diagonally across the compass from northwest to southeast, the wind funneled straight down the harbor in both directions. I woke up the next day with the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Carolyn was already up in the main salon, and I smelled oatmeal. I realized I had slept much later than the rest of my family. It was already 8:30, and we had a rule about starting school exactly at 9, but I didn't want to get up. The bow moved up and down over the waves that were rolling through Elizabeth Harbor, and big raindrops pounded on the deck. Someone had closed the forward hatch, and it was hot and stuffy inside the V-berth. Even though I never got seasick, the stuffy air and the oatmeal smell made me feel queasy. Dixie, the yellow parakeet we'd begged our parents for last summer, whistled and banged her head against the metal bars of her cage, which was almost directly over my bed. I tried to remember what was wrong. I heard Dad talking on the VHF radio to some other boater about the weather. It might blow like this for 3 more days, he said. I didn't hear the response. Dad's voice sunk into my stomach, and I remembered. I was a slut. I felt like it was written across my forehead in big black letters. It was there, but underneath it was written something else. I was a fighter. I was a fighter slut. I would fight the unfairness of being labeled. I waited until he had gone into the aft cabin to write before I got out of bed and made my way up to the table. Mom had left a bowl out for me, and the stainless steel pot of oatmeal was still on the table. Carolyn was already doing her schoolwork, sitting at the chart table with the Calvert School 5th grade syllabus spread out across her lap. "You slept too late," Carolyn said. "I'll be finished with school before you." "I don't really care," I said. "It's not like we're going to be able to do anything this afternoon." I didn't see the point in rushing through my schoolwork when the weather was this bad. I opened the lid to the oatmeal, but before I could spoon some of the sticky goo into my bowl, my stomach gave out and I threw up all over the salon table. I managed to get most of it into the pot of oatmeal. "Ew," Carolyn threw her book onto the floor and jumped up. "You puked in the oatmeal." She danced around the cabin, waving her hands over her head. Melanie puked in the oatmeal. Dad came out from his office and opened the companionway hatch to let in some fresh air. The sound of rain pelting the bimini top over the cockpit drowned out Carolyn's shrieks. Dad didn't say anything, just looked at the mess and shook his head. Mom put on her yellow foul-weather gear and climbed out the hatch with a pot of oatmeal and puke so she could throw it overboard. I tried to clean up the rest of the mess. Mom took my temperature once we had restored a sense of order to Chenu. I didn't have a fever, and I felt fine. She made me eat some wheat bread, and I crawled back into the forward cabin to start my schoolwork. I sat where I always did, propped up on my bunk with my feet on Carolyn's side, and my book spread over my knees. I kept all my books and papers in a file box, which stayed at the foot of the V-berth when I wasn't using it. I tried to focus on a page of geometry problems, but I couldn't. I looked in the back of the book for the answers. I wondered if this was what happened to kids in regular school who had problems concentrating. I'd heard about attention deficit disorder and about how parents relied on drugs to make their kids concentrate. Maybe I needed drugs. Instead of reading the chapters in my history textbook about the Civil War, I pulled out a blank piece of paper and wrote a poem. Maybe I just needed to write. Maybe I'd send it to some poetry contest when we got back to the States. I was starved by the time Mom fixed lunch. She fried falafel in vegetable oil, and Dixie, the parakeet, tried to mimic the frying sound. "Stupid bird," I said, and opened the cage. I wondered what would happen if Dixie flew into the frying pan. Instead, Dixie flew up into the main salon and perched on top of Carolyn's head. Carolyn acted like she didn't even notice, and Dixie clicked her beak as she chewed on honey-blonde strands of Carolyn's hair. Dad came out of the aft cabin, and we all sat around the salon table for lunch. "It still smells like puke in here," Carolyn said. She held a piece of falafel up to Dixie, whose beak dripped with oil. "We are trying to eat," Dad said. "I don't smell anything," Mom said. We finished lunch without talking. It rained for the rest of the day, and Mom and Dad spent the afternoon arguing in the aft cabin. Carolyn and I sat in the salon and listened to them speak to each other in clipped and harsh tones. Mom had lost the lens of one of her cameras, and Dad ranted about how much it would cost to replace. "We are on a limited budget," he said. "We can't stay out here forever if we keep having to replace expensive equipment. I'm trying to make money for us by writing, but I can only make so much." I couldn't hear Mom's response, although I imagined it to be rational and quiet, reminding him that there was still plenty of money saved up and that our lifestyle wasn't threatened by the loss of a camera lens. I decided as I listened that it wasn't so bad to be a slut. I'd heard my parents call each other things that were just as bad when they lost their tempers. Dad was most likely to lose his temper during cold fronts. It could have been cabin fever, or the possibility weighing in the back of his mind of another boat dragging into us. These were the days when we were stuck aboard, at anchor, and with no safe way to reach the shore, that I wondered what it would be like to live in a big comfortable house like the kids back in Virginia. On the third day of being stuck on the boat, I woke up after 9. I hadn't been able to get to sleep the night before because I'd stayed up late reading and eating Hershey's Kisses from the bag I'd snuck up into the forward cabin. Mom always made sure we had a good supply of chocolate on the boat, and I knew where all the storage spaces were. Mom and Dad slept in too because they stayed up drinking boxed red wine. It wasn't raining anymore, but the waves were still pitching Chez Nous around, and the salt spray outside felt like rain. I didn't want to work on geometry, so I cheated on my math problems again and focused on writing a poem. Carolyn threw a tantrum when Mom tried to get her to diagram sentences. Dad shut the door to the aft stateroom and ignored us all, lost in his writing. Michelle called on the VHF sometime during the long afternoon. We switched over to channel 72, which was my favorite because it rhymed with Chez Nous, and I liked saying it. "How are you all holding up over there?" "Over," Michelle said. She was well trained in proper radio etiquette, and like me, I think she enjoyed knowing that her voice was being transmitted across the entire anchorage. The range on most VHF radios was at least 10 miles, depending on the signal strength and the height of your antenna. "Okay, everyone's fighting over," I said. "Oh yeah, we're all fighting here too. Over," she said. "It must be the weather, cabin fever, over." "It must be. Well, maybe we'll be able to go ashore tomorrow, over." Before we could finish talking, Dad was in the main cabin grabbing the microphone from me. "That's nobody's business," he said. "Don't you know everyone in the harbor is listening?" "Just let me finish talking to Michelle," I said. "Melanie, are you there? Over." Michelle's voice sounded smaller. "Yeah, I have to go. Chez Nous clear, over," I said. I switched the radio back to 16. Carolyn sat back and waited for whatever was coming next. and Mom pretended not to be paying attention. She was brushing gesso across one of her canvas boards, gesso, preparing to start another painting, and the air inside the boat smelled like acrylic paint and thinner. What's wrong with what I said? I hung the VHF microphone back up over the chart table. I just don't think everyone in Georgetown needs to know what goes on in our family. It's none of their business, Dad said. Do you really think everyone in Georgetown is listening in to my radio conversation? Yes, he said. He stormed back into the aft cabin and shut the door again. He was busy writing his own version of our life, one that had begun appearing in all the big boating magazines. He was writing about perfect beaches, serene anchorages, and homeschooled kids who got perfect scores on all the standardized tests. He was writing about how living on a boat brought families together in ways that were impossible on land. My dad could be good at anything he decided to do, and what he had decided to do was become one of the best and most popular boating writers in the industry. He wrote because he enjoyed it, and because the payout from a structured settlement that he'd won for a client in which he had supported our family in our early years of cruising was running its course. He had to find a new way to make money. When he'd started writing, he submitted his articles to the boating magazines with fervor, tossing the rejection letters aside and submitting again until his articles were accepted. The cruising community loved his sense of humor and his practical tips and his how-to guidance on raising a family aboard. But as anyone with his sense of propriety would do, he only wrote about the things he wanted people to know. His daughters were growing up around him and doing the things that post-pubescent girls do, and this dose of reality weighed heavily on him. He could not, as much as he wanted to, write his way back to the days when he and I sat on the back of Chenoo, slurping down raw oysters and dreaming of heading south. Skinny, Virginia, summer of '93, age 13. Rod broke up with me by letter after we left Georgetown. The problem was that I didn't get the letter until after another boat kid had stopped in Pipe Creek and told me that Rod had been going out with a younger, thinner girl with bigger boobs than mine. They even go over to the ocean beach and mess around, she told me. I cried and nursed my first broken heart as I listened to sad country music on cassette tape and stashed bag after bag of Hershey's Kisses in the cabinet above my bunk. I ate them while I was doing schoolwork and while I was reading or just hanging out in my room and hiding from the world. The chocolate gave me a high that made everything else fade out and seem unimportant. Even though I was physically active, going diving with my dad almost every afternoon, and hunting for conch and grouper and lobster, my weight crept up and my self-esteem crept down. Halfway back up the Intracoastal, I decided that I would lose a bunch of weight, and that Rod would most certainly like me again when I returned to Georgetown the following winter. I asked my mom about diets, and she told me that she'd tried several. There was one where you ate less than 1,200 calories a day, and one where you ate less than 20 grams of fat. The low-carb craze was still about 10 years in the future. Mom applauded my dieting, but reminded me that I needed to keep eating healthy things like fruits and vegetables. If one could lose weight on 1,200 calories a day, it made sense to me that one could lose even more on 900, so I started measuring everything I ate, carefully portioning out 1-cup servings of Special K cereal and eating light yogurt cups. We were back in Virginia, docked at the lot, so convenience food was an option, whereas it wouldn't have been in the Bahamas. I went grocery shopping with Mom every week, selecting diet-friendly foods, fat-free fig Newtons, Snackwells, lean lunch meats, and low-calorie bread. On these same shopping trips, Carolyn haphazardly tossed bags of Oreo cookies into the shopping cart, and anger boiled in my stomach as I looked at her skinny legs and narrow hips, and the way her hair cascaded across her shoulders and down her back. To her waist, it was so easy for her to stay thin. She was always eating, scarfing down candy, cookies, while I ate my 70-calorie artificially sweetened yogurt cups, one tiny bite at a time, hoping that the next bite would satisfy my hunger. I told myself that hunger was a virtue and that it made you feel more. I was convinced that when hungry I could write better poetry and be a more creative person. The lot was lonely. There were no other kids around, and we spent most days performing maintenance on the boat and finishing the season's schoolwork. Carolyn and I stripped down and repainted an old sailing dinghy that my parents had owned for years, work that Carolyn hated but that I relished. My arms felt strong as I sanded, and I loved seeing the fresh paint glisten as it dried in the hot Virginia sun. I loved the way it smelled clean and metallic, the copper in the anti-fouling paint that we put on the bottom to keep seaweed from growing seemed to jump into the air in tiny sparks. When we finished, it was to become our own sailing dinghy. To us, this was just like having a car. That summer was particularly hot, and the jellyfish blossomed in the Chesapeake Bay earlier than usual. Dad cursed them as he dove on Chenoo to scrub barnacles from the prop. Soon I was eating fewer than 700 calories a day. Breakfast was a cup of Special K, lunch was half a piece of bread with some lettuce and some lunch meat, and dinner was whatever meat Mom had cooked and a small portion of vegetables. I ate as little as I could eat without being called out by my family. I weighed myself every day, happy to see my weight falling and falling. My clothes were baggy, and my thighs no longer rubbed together. I started running in place up in the forward cabin every morning, blasting music. I ran for an hour before I let myself eat breakfast, and I ran so hard that my feet wore a hole in the carpet that covered the teak and holly cabin sole. The hair on my arms and my face began to grow thicker, although the strands were fine and brittle. My nails broke easily, and sometimes I felt dizzy. Sometimes I felt so angry that I wanted to be violent. Carolyn eating her Oreos and drinking calorie-laden orange juice infuriated me. Once as I walked behind her on the wooded path leading from where we kept our car parked to the dock, I watched her brown back glistening in a scoop-necked bathing suit. Her hair flowed down her shoulders, and the sun coming through the trees set it on fire. How was she so beautiful and thin without even trying? I carried a bucket that I'd been asked to fetch from our Oldsmobile. Without thinking, I drew my arm back and hurled the bucket at the small of Carolyn's back. It hit her with a thwack and bounced off, landing in the dry leaves and rustling to a stop. Carolyn turned to look at me, her eyes wide and her mouth open. I'm sorry, I said, panicking inside. Why had I done that? What kind of evil lived in me that would make me want to hurt someone without even thinking about it? My dad's temper was dark, but never physical. Was whatever was inside me even darker? Carolyn scampered down the hill, putting distance between herself and me. She never told Mom and Dad about it, or if she did, nobody said anything to me. Occasionally the Neale grandparents drove to the lot and took us out to dinner in Kilmarnock, the small town located nearby. We went to a family restaurant that served giant burgers and steak fries. I would order a burger and eat the entire thing, returning later to Chenoo to hurl into the toilet in the forward head. I learned to do this quietly, shoving my fingers into the back of my throat until the vomit came out in a stream, any sound stifled by my hands now cupped over my mouth. Our boat was small, and it would be easy for someone to hear me, but I don't think anyone ever did. As I looked in the mirror, I stared at my jawline, which now seemed so well defined and strong, and so much more beautiful than the soft one I'd had a few months ago. Rod will have to like me now, I thought. My parents finally noticed that I had a problem. Only a couple of months had gone by since I started my diet, but at this point I was constipated and eating about 500 calories a day. They pulled me into the aft cabin to talk to me about how I'd gotten too skinny, and how they were afraid I was anorexic. My mom fed me oatmeal and whole wheat bread until my system started working properly again, and by August I had regained some of my weight. I was still thin, and when we left the lot to spend some time at Narrows Marina, the land kids were much more accepting. They still teased me for being different, saying things like, "Do your parents still run around naked?" But it was more good-natured and more out of habit than anything else. I was no longer Thunder Thighs or Buffalo Butt. I wondered if the simple act of getting skinny had suddenly made me more socially acceptable. I knew it had, but I questioned why this was so important to people. Weren't we all taught that what mattered the most was on the inside? It felt good to be accepted, but part of me hunkered down at the point and prepared to battle. I would not be normal, and I would not fall into the trap of judging people for their outside appearance, or their ages, or their gender, or status. We spent time in the playground more as a place to hang out. Playing was what kids did. There really wasn't much to do at Narrows besides hang out on people's boats and watch TV and movies. Since we didn't have a TV in our main salon and my parents didn't believe in watching TV during the daytime, I spent all my time on the weekends on one of the power boats inside the rickety boat shed. Trey's boat was the biggest. One Saturday morning in August, I climbed onto Trey's boat to join the usual kids, who were sprawled out on the floor watching some action movie and passing around a bag of potato chips. A blond boy in the corner caught my eye. I had never seen him before. He had eyes that reminded me of an owl's, except they were blue and spaced far apart, and his lanky body was draped across the couch. Unlike Trey and Rod and the other boys I was used to hanging out with, he had thick blonde hair on his arms, and when he spoke to me his voice was deep. On autopilot, I took a seat next to him. "I'm Will," he said, and shook my hand like one adult would shake another adult's, and that's how I felt, like we were the only two adults in the room. His legs were long, and his skin was tanned, and it unnerved me when he looked at me. The other kids watched the movie, and Will and I chatted. He lived on a farm west of Richmond, which he hated. He and Trey had known each other since 4th grade, and coming out to Narrows Marina with Trey was a way to escape the monotony of the farm for a weekend. He listened to country music, and he was fascinated by Edgar Allan Poe. Later, when the group of us moved to the V-berth to hang out, Will pulled me over and kissed me. I was surprised but went along with it. This was different from kissing Rod. I didn't feel like I needed to spit afterwards. We exchanged addresses on Sunday, and he wrote me a letter the next day. When my dad handed me the envelope after his daily run into town to the post office, he squinted at the return address as if he wasn't sure whether or not he should give it to me. I took it from him without speaking and settled into my bunk to read. The letter was written on lined composition paper, and Will's handwriting was neat and small. He apologized for not giving me a proper goodbye. Trey's family had left so hastily that he hadn't had time to find me, but he thought he was in love with me and hoped that he would see me again. I wrote back telling him that we would be at the marina for another month or so if he could come down again with Trey, and that I would like to see him. He came down on Labor Day weekend, but Trey did his best to keep us away from each other. We walked on the beach on Saturday, holding hands, and talked about life on the farm and life on the boat, and later sat pressed together on Trey's boat watching movies. But by Sunday, Trey had convinced his parents that they needed to go out for a cruise on the Pionkatonk River. Out on the boat, away from me, he'd have his best friends to himself. The weekend ended abruptly, and just like the time before, Will and I didn't get a chance to say goodbye. The Tuesday after Labor Day, Carolyn unpacked her Calvert school boxes for 7th grade, and I started high school. Calvert only went through 8th grade, so my parents had researched high school homeschool programs thoroughly and chosen to use the curriculum provided by Brigham Young University. One of my mom's 4 sisters was Mormon, but other than that we had no ties to the religion. It was just a good medium-priced program that met the accreditation requirements of the Commonwealth of Virginia and would provide me with a real, honest-to-goodness high school diploma from Mountain View High School in Orem, Utah. The classes came packaged separately, each with their own teacher's manuals and textbooks and materials. Unlike Calvert, the teacher's manuals were written for the student and not the parent. I had been teaching myself for a few years now, confining myself to the space in the V-berth for my lessons while Mom worked with Carolyn in the main salon. I still consulted with her for the Mom difficult math problems, and Dad liked to teach history lessons, seating me on the floor in the aft cabin while he preached his interpretation of historical events. The Civil War was really the war between the states, and had less to do with slavery than it did with states' rights, and the embargo against European industrial goods that made it difficult for southern states to sell cotton, and retold the great stories that he said made up our society and culture. You need to learn history so that you can learn how to avoid the mistakes people have made in the past, he said. He spent the hours when he wasn't writing or working on the boat preparing history lessons and reading the textbooks that came with our programs. He underlined the passages that he wanted us to remember and thought of ways to make the material interesting. Now, with the new program from BYU, I was officially my own teacher. The independence was refreshing. I listened to music while I focused on the lessons, the less demanding subjects like literature and English, and learned how to get the more difficult subjects over with first thing in the morning so that I had more time to do the nice things I enjoyed. Will wrote me a letter a few weeks after Labor Day saying that he had gotten back together with his old girlfriend who had helped him through a difficult time when his grandmother died. It seemed like an oddly mature thing for a 13-year-old to say. I wrote him back telling him that I was sorry to hear about his grandmother and that we were getting ready to leave Virginia and head south. I secretly wondered what Trey had told him about me. Maybe he'd told Will that a year ago I'd been nicknamed Thunder Thighs. I told myself that Will and I would never have been able to date each other anyway, since he lived miles away on a farm. He would need the company of local girls who listened to country music and could do things with him like go to the state fair and kiss on the school bus. Long-distance relationships would surely be a part of my life, but to someone who didn't live on a boat, this was a hard concept to grasp. Will was everything that was normal to me and everything that I was sure I was destined not to have. The school dances, the movie dates, the making out in a parked car out on a dirt road where nobody could find you. I grieved through the fall and told myself there would be lots of boat boys in Georgetown that year. The Dream, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, spring of '94, age 14. The winter flew by with the usual patterns. We spent a couple of months in the Pipe Creek area and a couple months in Georgetown. Will continued to write me letters, mainly between breakups with his hometown girlfriends, and I wrote him back as a friend because I'd found an audience in him that loved to hear about my life and the things we did that to me seemed mundane because we did them all the time. But he was fascinated by the fact that we speared all our fresh fish and received our mail by boat. Michelle and I were inseparable that winter. We talked about Georgetown boys in the V-berth of Chez Nous, Carolyn laying in her bed and hiding beneath her comforter, pretending not to listen but hearing every word we said. Michelle dated a boy who was 4 years older than her, and we tried to keep it a secret from her dad. Her dad would never have approved of him, both because of his age and because he wasn't a Jehovah's Witness, a religion that Gary had adopted as part of his marriage to Michelle's stepmother. Coming back to Fort Lauderdale in '94 was like coming back almost every year. Chez Nous rolled across the Gulf Stream on a near-perfect day. I spent most of it on the bow, looking into the deep blue water and trying to come up with words other than blue to describe it. When I tired of writing, I tuned into my small FM radio to see if I could pick up the stations out of Miami. I learned that Kurt Cobain had just shot himself, and when I had tried to reach my friends in Georgetown over the long-range SSB radio to tell them, Dad grabbed the microphone out of my hands. "This is an emergency radio," he said. "Someone might think that somebody important died." I didn't bother trying to explain that Cobain was important. I kept quiet and watched the ocean. We caught a dolphin fish on the fishing line Mom had trailed out behind the boat, and it slapped its green and yellow tail against the deck and speckled everyone with metallic-smelling blood before Mom poured rum down its gills and it went quiet. I cleaned it. I was pretty good with a fillet knife at 14. I'd spent a lot of time watching my dad and other men clean fish, and I was starting to read Hemingway, so fish blood seemed natural. Fort Lauderdale looked like a massive freighter on the horizon. Then it turned into a spiky forest of skyscrapers as we got closer. This didn't seem like a bad thing to me then. It meant cheap payphones, ice cream, FM radio stations, YM and 17 magazines, the Galleria shopping mall on Sunrise Boulevard, Borders and Barnes & Noble, clean laundry, Miami subs, and wacky evening news stories on Channel 7. South Florida was a different kind of homecoming than arriving in the Bahamas or the Chesapeake, but it felt just as good. I was starting to attach myself to South Florida in a way I didn't understand, the same way I'll never understand home or know where it is, but the dark underbelly of it drew me in. The freak show at the local grocery store, the secretive hookers on US 1, the murders in the mystery novels I read by John D. MacDonald. The novels featured a guy who lived on a houseboat at Bahia Marina and who got caught up in all these great adventures that involved boozing, sleeping with various women, and solving mysteries. But he lived on a boat in Fort Lauderdale, so he must have been a good guy. We docked at the city docks at Las Olas, 2 blocks west of the beach, and checked in with customs and rented a car. Dad and I ran out to Publix. When we bought ice cream for dessert that night and fresh bagels and smoked salmon for breakfast the next day, we went to the Miami subs on 17th Street and ordered onion rings and Italian subs. The dolphin we'd caught earlier would have to go in the freezer. We'd been eating fresh fish and beans and rice for 6 months, and getting back to the States called for a junk food celebration. Mom was out on deck when we got home, hosing the salt and fish blood off the cabin windows. The sun sank down into the Everglades, leaving a trail of orange across the Intracoastal Waterway, and the Los Olas Bridge let off 5 short horn blasts to indicate that the 7:30 opening was over. South Florida was hot even at sunset from the sticky asphalt and concrete and glass reflections off the condos. Melanie said, as soon as Dad and I stepped onto Chez "You need to call Michelle." "Why?" "The people on that boat just came here from Indiantown." She pointed over to a 36-foot trawler, a boat I recognized from the Bahamas even though I didn't know the people. Indiantown was a small town in central Florida where Michelle's dad had bought property and set up a car lot, and where Michelle now lived during the summers. It was right on the Okeechobee Waterway, and the Indiantown Marina was well known for being one of the cheapest marinas and boatyards in Florida. Mom coiled the hose on the deck. They said Michelle's boat caught fire. Very bad. I set the grocery bags aboard Chez and held onto the teak railing, feeling like I suddenly knew why South Florida was so unnaturally hot. "The whole family had to move off, I think," Mom said. "I had to call Indiantown Marina and leave a message, since the phone line on Summer Wind was dead. I left the number for our slip in Fort Lauderdale, since we had temporarily set up a phone line at the marina. I didn't hear back from Michelle for a couple of days. When I did, she said, "Terry thinks it was my fault." Michelle had been babysitting the kids while Gary and Terry were at the car lot, and something had shorted out in the engine room. She smelled fire and got the kids off the boat before running back in to grab the fire extinguisher and start flipping off circuit breakers. Fiberglass has to reach extreme temperatures before it burns, but when it does, it goes fast, and it smells a lot like human hair or fingernails burning. Michelle grabbed a few things off the boat, photos and letters, and stood on the dock with the kids, keeping them as far away as she could until the fire truck showed up. The marina owner cut Summerwind loose from the docks so it wouldn't catch any of the other boats on fire, and Michelle said she tried to jump back aboard to see what else she could save, but they wouldn't let her. "You've never smelled anything like it, Melanie," she said, "and it still smells. They put the fire out and the boat's still in one piece, but the smell is never going to go away." I was seeing it all, playing it out for her in my mind while she told me about it. I saw flames licking through the portholes and reaching up around the mast. Summerwind was a Morgan Out Island 41, one of the toughest fiberglass boats ever built, and I couldn't imagine it burning that easily. "Did you lose much of your stuff?" I asked. "No, Terry did though. You know how their cabin is right by the engine room." "Is she pissed?" "She's always pissed. What are you all going to do?" "My dad has a trailer sitting in the car lot. We're going to bring it down to the marina and live in it while they get their house built," she said. "They're building a house?" "Yeah, I'm not moving in though. I'm going to stay on Summerwind and get her back into shape." That was how Michelle moved onto Summerwind, completely on her own at 14. Her dad and Terry and the kids were moving ashore, and she couldn't do it. She said the boat was like a person, that she felt like it needed her, especially after the fire. She drove out to the coast with her dad a few days later for the Dania Marine Flea Market. Gary hauled all the things they didn't need from the boat to Donis and set up a booth, and he and Michelle sat in it for 3 days trying to sell old outboard motors, Michelle's sailing dinghy, her windsurfer, old sails, and anything else from the boat that hadn't been too badly damaged in the fire. My dad and I met up with them on the first day of the flea market. We drove down US 1 past the Fort Lauderdale airport into the seedier and more comforting parts of South Florida, past the Dania J. Ali, where the flea market was set up in the huge parking lot, with aisles and aisles of broken down boat stuff. We found Michelle and Gary sitting on their gray inflatable Zodiac tank, planted solid on the asphalt. Neither of them looked like they wanted to be there. Michelle and I ran into each other's arms, squealing, and Gary hoisted himself off the tank, a button popping off his shirt, which hung mostly open around his belly. Sweat dripped off the corners of his mustache. "Don't know what to think about all this, Tom," he said, slapping my dad on the shoulder. Dad jumped a little, then relaxed, but I could see the vein pumping in his neck, and I secretly hoped Gary had managed to smudge a little bit of outboard motor oil on his slick polo shirt so he'd fit in with the flea market crowd a bit better. Dad always wore polo shirts that had the Cruising World magazine logo stitched on, partly to let people know he was a writer and to remind them that whatever they did or said could possibly end up in a magazine article, and partly to promote the magazine. "Must be a sad time," Dad said. He scanned all the junk set up in Gary's booth. Michelle's windsurfer was propped up against the U-Haul trailer, and the Janet Jackson lyrics Michelle and I had painted across the board looked sloppy and crooked. Yeah, well, you know how it is, Gary said. He yawned and put his hand on Michelle's shoulder. Gotta move on. The wife doesn't want anything to do with the boat any more. Guess the fire was some kind of sign. Not that I believe in signs, but everything happens for a reason, you know. His Michigan accent kicked in. You guys are building a house. Dad was shifting from one foot to the other and looking over Gary's shoulder the whole time. He was supposed to be meeting his buddy from the Marine Industries Association. Yeah, opening a car lot. The plan is to sell a few El Caminos to the Guatemalans, Gary said. Nobody else will finance them out there, you know. Indiantown was smack in the middle of Orange County country. Oh, hey, I'm sorry, Gary. I've got to talk to someone, Dad said. He waved to a man in an equally snazzy polo shirt. Gary, this is Hank, he said. They all shook hands. Hank spelled out his Marine Industries Association credentials, and Gary just said, Nice to meet you, Hank. Boy, that's a good handshake. Your arm must get tired. Hank opened his mouth, then closed it, at a loss for words. Michelle and I had been sitting on the deck. Oh God, she said, my dad is embarrassing your dad's friends. Hey, let's walk around a little bit. Sure, I was eager to get away. We stepped out of the shade and into the glorious April heat wave to explore the other booths. We saw a few people we knew from Georgetown, sailboaters carrying huge canvas bags, people with dark tans and home-styled haircuts, cut-off jeans and faded t-shirts that smelled like old sunscreen and pot smoke. I filled my lungs and my soul with it. Young kids that might have belonged to the other boaters or to the flea market gypsies ran around hiding behind engine blocks and stands that sold cheap tie-dye shirts. Michelle stopped in front of a bulletin board that had local ads for boats and marine services tacked up, overlapping each other in a sloppy mess. Look at that, she said. A Morgan 41, and they want $120,000 for it. Ha, someone could get a good deal on Summer Wind now if my dad decides to sell her. You really think he's gonna sell her? Why else would we be getting rid of all our stuff? She looked around like she was trying to find a place to sit, but settled for leaning up against the bulletin board. I love that boat, she said. Maybe not as much as I loved Indian Summer, but a lot. You know what I mean. It's like it's human or something. And I don't know what she meant because I'd always felt the same way. And I did know what she meant because I always felt the same way about Chenu, even though I never talked about it. Sometimes I thought I shared a soul with the boat because Chenu and I were born and built on the same year. You'll be able to fix her, I said. A tear came out from under Michelle's sunglasses, but she pushed it away with the back of her hand and smiled. Yeah, but you know how I feel, right? I don't think anybody else does, except my dad, you know. I wish it was still just him and me on Indian Summer, before Terry and the kids and everything. She turned back to the board and ran her finger over the ad for the Morgan 41. Wait a second, she said, and I could hear her breath catching in the back of her throat. I looked at the board. Her finger had fallen on another ad, one for a smaller sailboat. It was an O'Day 30, 1978, almost identical to Indian Summer. The ad said atomic four-gas engine, good condition, new sails, shoal draft 7,900. It was a nice, practical boat, but right below it was an ad for a Tartan 27, smaller with cleaner lines, almost the same price. I think it hit both of us then, one of those earth-shattering moments that feels kind of like a déjà vu. Our similarities and our differences were summed up in those two boats. Michelle's choice more practical, mine based on the Tartan's pretty lines, but the dream was the same. Let's buy a boat together, Michelle said. Now? No, silly, when we are 17 or 18, we'll save up for a few years. Then we'll live on it and sail around, go different places and work. It made perfect sense at the time. I wanted to yell and scream and tell Michelle how much I loved her.